got this clock. I'm I'm worried about going over my 15 minutes, so I needed a big clock. A few weeks ago, I hosted an evening at my studio. It was a reception for BASIC, which is an NGO that I'm a board member of, and I shall talk a little bit more about that later. What was interesting about this reception was the eclectic audience. I've had a lot of odd events at my studio, and I've seen some pretty strange gatherings of people there, but this was probably the most eclectic. There were parliamentarians, peers from all across the political spectrum. There was an American Undersecretary of State, there was a senator, there were lots of artists, musicians, journalists, writers, filmmakers. A very peculiar group of people. And so the question is, what was it that brought all these people together? Well, the answer is nuclear disarmament, the prospect of nuclear disarmament. Now, a lot of you people in this room are close to my age, so you probably think like I once thought, didn't we solve that problem a long time ago? Isn't that something that belongs to the 60s or at best the 70s? Actually, we didn't solve the problem, and it's still going on. It's a very live problem. There are still 23,000 nuclear weapons, many of them ready to fire, many of them very old and probably about to fire spontaneously. And that 23,000 weapons is equivalent to about 120,000 Hiroshimas. So the problem's still here. We've just kind of moved on. It isn't a very glamorous problem anymore. We talked about it so much in the past. You know, I marched with CND, as I'm sure some of you did. And I kind of thought the problem had gone away. But it hasn't. It's still here. And in fact, to the extent that in his State of the Union address, President Obama said that it's the greatest threat. Not a big threat, the greatest threat. So why were we talking about it? Actually, because now we're at a sort of hinge point in history where there's a chance to solve the problem. For the first time, really, since the invention of nuclear weapons, we're in a situation where we might be able to get rid of them. That's partly because we have a president who's committed to nuclear disarmament, the first time we ever have had, in fact. But it's also because there's a very unlikely coalition of people who are supporting that. So the unlikely coalition of people who met at my studio that evening reflects this movement in general. In America, there's Kissinger, Schultz, who you may remember, Senator Sam Nunn, who came to my studio the other day, various other people who ideologically would have been considered enemies. They certainly weren't friends in ideological or political terms for a long time. They've united in this cause. And in this country, we have the top-level group. This was formed last year. It's a group of parliamentarians and peers, again from across all of the parties, who've decided that a real priority is to get rid of nuclear weapons. And this is a very, very unusual group of people. Again, they are people who probably wouldn't have agreed on almost anything else in Parliament, but they have agreed on this. It includes Malcolm Rifkind, Michael Ancram, Des Brown, Ming Campbell. It's a really good collection of people. And it includes Baroness Shirley Williams, who spoke at the studio the other night. In fact, I'll read you something that Shirley said, if I can find it. She said, alongside climate change, there is no more urgent issue facing the survival of our fragile and beautiful planet than disarmament and the avoidance of proliferation. moving towards an elimination of nuclear weapons will require the mobilization of political will on an unprecedented scale. And I guess that's why I'm here, actually, because it won't happen without public support. So we have this unique moment when we can possibly change history, when we can turn back the clock and get these weapons out of the way. We have a unique coalition of people who are pushing this forward, mostly at the moment from the political classes. What I would like to do is to generalize this out so that it becomes a public issue. First of all, let me tell you why I think this is so important. There's, of course, the danger that we'll use these weapons intentionally, which would be a catastrophe. In any event, it would be a catastrophe if they were ever used. There's also the very real possibility that they'll be used accidentally. Now, this has nearly happened several times. It's something most of us don't know about, but in fact, there have been several occasions where these weapons were almost deployed, and in some of the cases, it was sheer disobedience on the part of quite junior army officials that stopped them being used. There's a famous case where a flight of geese triggered the Soviet weapons detectors, and it looked like they were being attacked. It was a rather junior officer who decided that they could not launch missiles on the basis of this. So he broke the rules. And in fact, several of these accidental occasions have been saved by somebody breaking the rules, distrusting the instruments, using their common sense in some way. Well, that isn't going to last forever. There's a good chance that somebody is going to obey orders eventually and launch a counterattack of several nuclear warheads against a flight of geese. Of course, then there's another spectre rearing its head, which is probably the real reason that Kissinger and Schultz and the members of the top-level group can agree on this, which is the possibility that these weapons, or versions of them, will get into the hands of terrorists. Now, of course, counterstrike means nothing if terrorists have nuclear weapons. There's no one to hit back to. So our nuclear advantage is completely negated by the possibility that other people might get nuclear weapons. And of course, the other serious issue about this is that we are not in a position to negotiate with the countries of the world and to say to them, please don't develop nuclear weapons, if we're still insisting on hanging on to ours. If we don't make very serious signs that we're ready to give up these weapons, and in fact we have started on that process now, but if we don't make it really clear, we do not have the moral high ground to say to countries like Iran and North Korea, but you can't develop them. We'll keep them, but you can't have them. So it's very, very important, if we want to rid the world of fissile materials to be used for military means, that we start to show progress in this. Well, this year, in May, we have the nuclear proliferation talks in New York. They look very hopeful because really Obama has changed the tone of the conversation, and because the Russians look interested, and as I said, we have the top-level group here in England who are showing interest in moving in this direction. So it looks like these NPT talks will be very important in the sense that they will put us on a serious road to nuclear disarmament. However, that won't happen unless there's really a lot of noise from the public, I think. The easiest thing to do is to change nothing, always. The easiest thing to do would be to have the talks and fill in the forms and send the documents off and have a few reports on the news, and for nothing much to change. That mustn't happen this time. We really have a chance now, because of this peculiar coalition of the willing, to make a big change here. And I want to put this in a bigger context as well. The failure of Copenhagen, of the climate change talks in Copenhagen, was really a catastrophe in a way. It was, to me, it was the end of the 20th century. The last 10 years for me have been the end of the 20th century. It seems to me that they were 20th century thinking transferred by accident into this millennium. What I hope is that for the first time we will seriously begin to act as one planet. And these nuclear talks are the easy way into that. If we can have a success in New York with the NPT talks, we sort of show the beginning of something, the beginning of a way of cooperating together as a planet, the beginning of a way of subsuming national interests in favor of global interests. And global interests are all of our interests, of course. So for me, the talks are very important, not only because they could begin to end the nuclear era, but because they could be the beginning of a serious third millennium, a third millennium where we start to look at the world as one place, and we start to realize that really we don't have very separate interests, we have shared interests in it. Now, I mentioned at the beginning BASIC, which is the NGO of which I'm a board member. BASIC stands for British American Security Information Council, which is a formidable name. BASIC has existed since 1987. As its name implies, it has an office in London and in Washington. And it was born essentially to advise on disarmament and on weapons control between these two transatlantic allies. So it has very good connections in Parliament, Congress, Senate, the House of Lords and so on. And it has done very good service in advising them about the often totally baffling minutiae of arms budgets. You know, for example, the last budget that was presented, defense budget that was presented in the American Congress was, I think, 680 pages long. Of course, nobody reads those kinds of documents, and of course, it's very easy to slip in little tricks within them. You know, on page 540, for example, there's a proposal to start a new generation of nuclear weapons. This happened a couple of years ago. So BASIC has been the organization that has helped to alert congressmen, parliamentarians, and so on to these details, which are very, very important to know about. What BASIC is committed to now, at this moment, because of the run-up to the NPT, is the idea of trying to make a popular movement that will support those politicians, those rather visionary politicians who've abandoned ideological differences, crossed party lines, and agreed to cooperate on this really very heroic pursuit, I think. It's very hard to take something apart that's as big as that, and which has as many very complex commercial interests involved and ideological interests involved. So these people need help. Shirley Williams, who's only about that tall, but is one of the most dynamic people on earth, I think, she needs help in this. She needs to know that when the NPT meets, when those conversations are being had, the rest of the world listens to them, and the rest of the world expects a result. And I believe there are some BASIC people here tonight. I don't know where they are, but if any of you feel moved to talk to them and to help us out in any way. That doesn't only mean money, but of course we never would turn that down. Please do find them and talk to them. In the meantime, I have to finish. I'd like to say welcome to the third millennium. I think it's going to start in May if this BASIC thing works out, this NPT thing works out. Thank you.